Well, hello, King of Kings. I am coming to you. This is actually my home office that I'm coming to you again from. I forgot to mention that last week. Um, but it's good to be able to bring you this teaching. But I have to tell you, on behalf of myself and the elders, we are all longing so much to be back together and to worship corporately and publicly together again on the Lord's Day. This Sunday is the fifth Sunday in Lent. It's the final Sunday of Lent. And as we approach Holy Week, the final psalm that we're going to be looking at before we enter into Holy Week is Psalm 110. And as we look at this psalm and as we examine this psalm and allow it to examine our hearts, this psalm contains two oracles that are going to shine like two different spotlights on the person and work of Jesus in beautiful ways. And the title for today's teaching is simply this: The Priestly King and the Kingly Priest. The Priestly King and the Kingly Priest. And this title reflects sort of the structure of the teaching today. And these two spotlights, I guess, is a good analogy or way to think about these two oracles as they come to us. So what is an oracle? An oracle is a divine announcement. And this psalm in particular, it contains two of them, as I mentioned. And the first oracle really is sort of couched within the first three verses of this psalm. Notice how this psalm begins. It begins by saying, "The Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool." Now, this particular section might sound familiar because it's actually within three of your four Gospels. The Gospel writers included a story from Jesus' life where he uses this psalm. And the basic structure of the story is Jesus is with a group of Pharisees and he asks them a question about the Christ. He essentially just says, "What do you think about the Christ? Whose son is he?" And they give him a very sort of conventional answer. They say he's the son of David. And so then he says this to them. This is in Matthew 22, the account that I'm looking at specifically. He says, "How is it then that David, in the Spirit, calls him Lord, saying, 'The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet'?" And then listen to what he says to them. "If then David calls him Lord, how is he his son?" And it says they did not know how to answer him after that. They had no answer. Why did they have no answer to him? Well, this is why. This psalm was actually kind of a little bit of a confounding psalm to many of the scribes and the Pharisees of this day, because their thought about the coming Messiah was that he was a mere man. They did not think about him in any more kind of elevated terms than that. They thought he was going to be mighty and a ruler, but they viewed him as a mere man. And this psalm very clearly indicates that he is one that's higher than David, which would not seem like someone that would come from David. And so Jesus brings this out before them and causes them to have to wrestle with this question of, what do you think of the Christ? And I think this is a kind of the question that we've laid over the whole of our Lenten journey is, who do you think of? When you think of Jesus, what do you think of him? Who is he? And so today in particular, we're going to see that the Christ is this divine, he is a mighty ruler, issuing forth his command, calling forth a people and sending them into enemy territory. The Christ is a kingly priest who offers of himself a sacrifice for the sake of his people. So I've kind of given you the end, the spoiler. That's okay though. Let's kind of back up and then kind of get there slowly together. So first of all, when you look at the first three verses of this psalm, you'll notice that the imagery is military imagery here. The picture that we see that the psalmist sets before us is of a mighty ruler issuing forth his power and authority into enemy territory. And Spurgeon, in speaking of this psalm, he says this. He connects it for us to the gospel. Listen to how he says this connection goes forth. He says, "Let the gospel be preached with divine unction, and the chosen of the Lord respond to it like troops in the day of the mustering of armies. They come arrayed by grace in shining uniforms of holiness, and for number, freshness, beauty, and purity. They are as the dewdrops which come mysteriously from the morning's womb." And you can see the picture and the imagery of these first three verses Spurgeon is picking up on here. This is a picture, in the largest sense, this is a picture of God himself enthroned on high, issuing forth the gospel of Jesus, which is, as Paul says, the power of God unto salvation. And he issues this forth, and those that the Spirit awakens to its call, they go from death to life. They go from blindness to seeing, from deafness to hearing. They hear this good news. Their hearts become alive. They become truly human once again. And God doesn't just leave them in this place, but he sends them forth into the world to do what God has designed us to do, to be his vice regents into the world, to be his representatives in the world. And so he issues us forth into his world, which has been marred by sin and wickedness, by death and disease. And so this first oracle, it awakens our attention to the cosmic power of God on display in Christ, in the Redeemer. It shows us the power of God in awakening our hearts to redemption, awakening us to the truth of who Christ is and what Christ has done. God is the one who does this. I think this is such a good thing for us to emphasize many times, that if your faith and trust is in Jesus, this is because God has acted upon you. This is because the Spirit has done something in you, giving you eyes to see the truth and the beauty of the good news. And if your heart's been awakened to this good news, you have been sent forth. I think it's a beautiful component of this psalm, is it shows us not only election, God's divine choosing of a people, but it shows us the purpose of election, that we are not only elect, but we are elect to be sent out into the world, to be a light to the nations, to be a testimony, as it were, as a people to the truth and the majesty and the glory of who God is. We go from the king's throne, on the king's mission, on the king's behalf, into enemy territory. That is sort of this picture here that we see with this mighty scepter and the people of God and their garments going out into the enemy territory. Now, if you're having flashbacks to movies like Saving Private Ryan or Braveheart, where you see these armies that kind of go into battle with this huge mission, and they realize that they're living for something much greater than themselves, you're pulling up the right kind of imagery here. This is what this psalm is really seeking to evoke: allegiance and loyalty to the great King who sends us forth into the world. Now, as we wrestle with this is sort of this first image that we come to of Christ as the great King of creation, who calls us, right? But the second image we come to, and the rest of this psalm really deals with the second oracle, which says this in verse 4: "The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind." It says, "You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek." Now, in the first oracle, the picture is of a king. In the second oracle, the picture is of this Melchizedek character. And it says this language of a forever priest, or a priest forever. And so what does this mean? Who is Melchizedek? You might not know who Melchizedek is, and you're probably not unlike many Christians and most people. Melchizedek kind of plays a relatively small role in the biblical story, but he plays a very significant one that is talked about later and pointed back to, especially by the author of Hebrews. But to give you some context, Melchizedek comes to us in the scope of the biblical story in the 14th chapter of Genesis. And what we see is Abram's nephew Lot has been captured by these enemies, and Abram goes after these enemies, defeats them, and he gets his nephew Lot and their possessions and their kinsmen, and he brings them back. And in the 14th chapter, we see that as he's returning from this battle, he's met by this king of Salem, is what the text says. Salem is the word for peace. It's where Jerusalem comes from. Jerusalem comes from that. It's connected to this word shalom. And so this king of Salem, Melchizedek, meets him. And this Melchizedek character is a very interesting character. We don't know a lot about him. We don't see his genealogy. We don't see the rest of his life. We don't hear about his death. And the author of Hebrews picks up on this. And he talks about this Melchizedek character as one without a father or mother or a genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life. And the author of Hebrews says that he's one resembling the Son of God, the one who is a high priest, or is a priest forever, it says in Hebrews chapter 7. So here we have this priest. The psalmist is putting forward to us this priest, Melchizedek, saying that he is one, a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek, a priest without an origin or ending. Why is this significant? Well, as God's people, they had a priestly line, a lineage. And this priestly line, these priests would come and they would serve as priests, but then they would die, and their priestly role would then cease, and it would continue on with the next priest. But this psalmist is saying the one who is coming is not going to look like these priests that you've seen. He is going to follow after the order of Melchizedek. He is going to be a priest forever. Now, we have such an amazing privilege as we sit in the 21st century to be able to look back and understand, as we see the person and work of Jesus, to understand the ways in which this psalm was pointing to Jesus. And the author of Hebrews picks up on this. And the author of Hebrews is drawing these lines kind of for the first time, I think, for people clearly, that Jesus is the one that Melchizedek was pointing to. Melchizedek, back in Genesis 14, was a type, was kind of a prefigurement, if you will, of Christ, who is the forever priest. Now, as we kind of close this teaching, I want to end it by sort of talking about why I think this psalm is so significant for us today. We live within a context of a world with all sorts of things that vie for our allegiance and our attention. They vie for our affection. And you need to be very aware of this. We say that we want these psalms to examine our hearts. I think this is a moment for our hearts to be examined as a people. This psalm comes to us, the book of Psalms is broken up into 5 books. I don't know if you knew that or not. The 5th book is largely attributed to the period of time after the exile of the Israelites, after the exile of God's people. And if you know much about this post-exilic time, you'll know that they didn't have kings during that time of history. They had kings prior to the exile, and in fact, it was because of the wickedness and faithlessness of many of the kings that they ended up in exile. But when they came back from their period of time in exile, they didn't have kings. And yet there is this royal psalm, Psalm 110, that exists within the Psalter, that cries forth, that provides for them expression of worship as a people. And this is the position they found themselves in after the exile. They lived within the context of empire, where there was a ruler that required your allegiance. And they, as God's people, had a very important choice to make. Would they find themselves coming under the sort of the dictates of this ruler and pledging their allegiance to him? Or would they remain a distinct people in the midst of empire? This was a very significant moment of shift, if you will, in the people of God and how they thought about themselves in the world. And yet this psalm remains a part of their story. They chose to remain, as we know, a distinct people, meaning that they pledged their loyalty not to this imperial king, but to Yahweh. They pledged their loyalty not to the ruler of the empire, but to the one who was to come, this God who had rescued them and had promised them a Messiah that was coming. And I think it's important for us, King of Kings, to recall this, because we live in a world that's actually filled with all sorts of different things that ask for your allegiance, not only your time and your money and your attention, but your affection. Ask for your heart. And as these two spotlights shine the light on the person of Christ, I want us to fix our eyes on him. He is the author and the perfecter of our faith. And this first light that we see that Christ is the King of Kings. His throne extends to the farthest reaches of the universe and over every single kingdom that you know of, every single empire that existed all the way back to God's people, all the way through to today and into the future. His rule extends over it all. He's the creator and the sustainer of everything that exists. He is the all-powerful ruler. He is the priestly king. But allow the other spotlight to shine brightly as well. That Christ, the Messiah, that Jesus is the great high priest. He is a kingly priest. In his body, he has provided the sacrifice for you once for all of his people. He is the one making intercession for you even now. Do you see him as king? Do you see him as priest? Do you in your life see your allegiance directed to the one and only, the priestly king, the kingly priest, Jesus Christ?